So we've looked at how to create queries using fields from the database and sort and search them, and we've also looked at how to perform calculations, but there's one more technique which can be really powerful in Access, which is to use grouping to create something called aggregate queries. So let's have a look at how to do that. The first thing we need to do is go to Query Design and create a new query as we've done before, and we're going to be using the same data as we did before. So previously we've looked at things like adding records to the database, adding fields. So we can choose continent, for example, and if I look at that query, what we see is a list of 147 continent names, and they don't appear in any particular order. So one of the things I can do in my design view at the top is to click this button with the Greek letter sigma on it, which is the same as the one that appears on the auto sum button in Excel. So if we click on there, what we get is this extra row appears in the bottom section of the query. So by default it's set to group by, and if we run my query now, let's see what's happened. So what's happened firstly is it only shows each continent once, so it's only showing unique values from that particular field. It's also sorted them into order for us. So that's quite a useful technique if you want to, for example, show lists of things in combo boxes on forms. So if you wanted to have people select a continent, for example, on a form, you can group so each thing only appears once. What happens if we add a second field? So if we add country, for example, what happens then? Well, what that does, we now see that continent is duplicated, because what this does is it shows unique combinations of both fields. So each country only appears once, so there's no duplication to remove there. But if we had a database with forename and surname on it, and there were several people called John Smith, for example, it would show that name John Smith only once, even though it's only in two fields. So we can do that. Where grouping really comes into its own, though, is when we do calculations with that information, or we count. So what we could do is we could count up those countries. So rather than showing them, we could count them. And if we do that, if we select count instead of group by and we run the query, what it shows us is how many countries there are in each continent. So 46 in Africa, 37 in Asia, etc. Doesn't give it a very friendly heading there, so we can use the colon as we did in other queries to give that a nicer name. So we call that count instead, for example. We can also perform other calculations. So if I wanted to find out the average life expectancy on the different continents, for example, then I can select average. Notice also I can select things like minimum, maximum, standard deviation and variance, so we can do quite a few different things there. So if I go for average, then we can see just with a quick click that people in Europe and in North America live the longest, and they live quite a bit longer, more than 20 years longer than people in Africa, for example. So this is very good for analysing data. What about if we don't want to analyse, everyone? What about if we wanted to find out the number of countries where the literacy rate was 100%? Well, we can do that as well. So we can include country and count them. But then we include the country, the field, that we want to inspect. So we put our criteria in as we would ordinarily with a selection query. But instead of group by, we need to select where. So now I'm grouping by continent and counting the number of countries where the literacy rate is 100%. So if I run that query now, look at the results, we can see that there's 1 country in Asia, 15 in Europe, 2 in Oceania. Surprisingly, none in North America, so that might be down to the way they measure it. But notice also that where the result is 0, the row is omitted completely. So that's a quick introduction to things you can do with grouping and aggregate queries. So you can group by particular values or combinations of values. You can perform some statistical analysis, so counting averages, find the minimum or the maximum, and you can still include criteria. So in this case, we found the number of countries in each continent where the literacy rate is 100%.